The year is 1529. The Ottoman army stands before the walls of Vienna, the furthest west any Islamic empire has ever reached. 100,000 men, 300 cannon, the heart of Europe within sight. And at the center of this tide of steel and silk and fire sits a man in gilded armor on a grey stallion, utterly still, watching. His name is Suleiman, the 10th Sultan of the House of Osman, the man his own people will call Kanuni, the lawgiver, the man the trembling courts of Europe will call magnificent. He is 35 years old. He has already conquered more of the earth than any ruler alive, and he is not finished. This is his story. Chapter 1. The world Suleiman inherited. In the year 1494, on the eastern shores of the Black Sea, in the Ottoman provincial capital of Trabzon, a child was born to a prince who did not yet know he would become the most feared ruler on earth. The child's name was Suleiman. His father was Shehzadeh Selim, a prince of terrifying energy, sullen ambition, and barely contained violence. His mother was Hafsa Hatun, a woman of quiet dignity who would live to see her son become a legend. The world Suleiman was born into was already Ottoman. His great-grandfather, Mehmed the Conqueror, had taken Constantinople in 1453, ending 1,000 years of Byzantine civilization and establishing Istanbul as the new Rome, the new center of the known world. His grandfather, Bayezid II, had consolidated that conquest, expanded the empire's reach into the Balkans and Anatolia, and welcomed the Jews expelled from Spain in 1492, one of the largest and most consequential acts of religious asylum in medieval history. But it was Suleiman's father, Selim I, Yavuz the Grim, who truly forged the empire the young Suleiman would inherit. Selim came to power through an act of extraordinary ruthlessness. He deposed his own father, Bayezid II, and had his brothers and nephews executed to secure the throne. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was cold Ottoman political logic. Divided loyalty meant civil war. Civil war meant dissolution. And Selim had plans that left no room for dissolution. In 8 years of reign, one of the shortest in Ottoman history, Selim tripled the size of the empire. He crushed the Safavid Shah Ismail at the Battle of Calderon in 1514, a victory that settled for a generation the great Sunni-Shia fault line running through the Islamic world. He swept into Egypt in 1516 and 1517, defeating the Mamluk Sultanate and absorbing the Arab heartlands, the cities of Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina, into the Ottoman realm. With Mecca and Medina in Ottoman hands, Selim assumed a title no Ottoman Sultan had held before, custodian of the 2 holy mosques. The Ottoman Empire was no longer merely a Turkic military state. It was the center of the Sunni Islamic world. And then, in September 1520, while planning what he believed would be the conquest of Europe, Selim I died, most likely of plague contracted during his campaigns. He was 54 years old, and he had burned through a lifetime in 8 years. His son Suleiman was 25. He had spent his apprenticeship governing provincial cities, Kaffa on the Crimean coast, then Manisa in western Anatolia, learning the machinery of empire from the inside. He was educated, introspective, and composed in a way his ferocious father had never been. He read Persian poetry. He wrote his own verses. He governed with a bureaucrat's precision and a philosopher's patience. The Janissaries, the empire's elite infantry force, the instrument of every Ottoman conquest since the 14th century, gave him their loyalty immediately. That was not guaranteed. The Janissaries had broken sultans before. They would break them again. That they did not break Suleiman says something about the impression he made from the very first day of his reign. Europe barely noticed. The ambassadors sent their condolences and their congratulations in the same breath, and privately reassured their courts that this young successor was not his father. He was bookish. He was gentle. He would be manageable. They were wrong in every particular. Chapter 2. The Education of a Sultan. To understand Suleiman, you must understand the system that made him. The Ottoman sultans did not grow up in palaces of leisure. They were educated with a deliberate ruthlessness that bordered on brutality, not physical brutality, but the relentless pressure of absolute expectation. From childhood, a prince of the House of Osman was trained in the full range of what sovereignty required. He learned Arabic and Persian, as well as Turkish, the 3 languages of Ottoman court life, scholarship, and law. He learned mathematics, astronomy, and the Quran. He He trained in archery, horsemanship, wrestling, and the management of weapons. He studied the histories of Alexander, of Tamerlane, of his own ancestors. He was taught to understand military logistics, siege engineering, naval strategy, and the arts of negotiation. And at a young age, typically in his early teens, a prince was sent to govern a provincial sanjak under the tutelage of experienced administrators and advisors. This was not symbolic. A shehzadeh, a royal prince, was expected to actually govern, to adjudicate disputes, to manage taxes, to defend his territory. Suleiman served in 3 provincial posts. Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula gave him exposure to the northern frontier, the world of the Crimean Tatars, the Genoese merchants, the Pontic steppe, Bolu, a smaller post in Anatolia, and then Manisa, in the fertile valley of western Anatolia, one of the most important provincial posts in the empire, the traditional seat of the Sultan's heir. In Manisa, Suleiman governed for 7 years. He administered a complex, wealthy, multi-ethnic province. He dealt with the silk trade, with local religious disputes, with the management of a large and restless Janissary garrison. He learned what government actually felt like from the inside, not the theory of it, but the grain shortages, and the court petitions, and the tax rolls. It was also in Manisa that Suleiman encountered the man who would become the closest friend and greatest catastrophe of his life, Ibrahim. Ibrahim had come into the palace as a page, a common path for talented non-Muslim boys captured or purchased in the devshirme system, the Ottoman practice of recruiting Christian children from the Balkans and training them for imperial service. Ibrahim was Greek-born, probably from the town of Parga on the Ionian coast. He was gifted, beautiful, magnetic, and possessed of a charm that made people trust him before they had thought carefully about whether they should. The friendship between Suleiman and Ibrahim was the kind that forms only in youth, when 2 people are thrown together before their characters have fully hardened, and it lasted, with increasing complexity and increasing danger, for 20 years. Chapter 3, The World Holds Its Breath. When Suleiman rode into Istanbul in September 1520, the city watched him in silence. He was 25 years old, lean, composed, with the angular face and deep-set eyes of his father, softened by his mother's quieter temperament. He wore a simple white ceremonial kaftan, no gold armor, no theatrical display of force. He rode without hurry, and he looked at the city as though he was memorizing it. His first acts as Sultan were deliberate signals. He released the Egyptian merchants his father had imprisoned. He returned property seized during Selim's campaigns. He executed a governor who had been enriching himself through extortion. And he sent a message to the great powers of Europe, the Habsburgs, Venice, the papacy, the Knights of St. John, that the new Sultan was open to negotiation. Europe interpreted the openness as weakness. Within 18 months, Suleiman had answered that misreading with steel. In 1521, he turned his attention west, to Belgrade. Belgrade was the key to Central Europe. It sat at the confluence of the Danube and the Sava rivers, the gateway between the Ottoman Balkans and the Kingdom of Hungary. His great-grandfather, Mehmed the Conqueror, had tried to take it in 1456 and failed, turned back by the legendary Hungarian crusader János Hunyadi. It had remained a wound in Ottoman strategic thinking for 60 years. Suleiman took it in 3 weeks. The speed was not luck. The Ottoman military machine in this period was the most sophisticated in the world. The Janissaries were a professional standing army, loyal, disciplined, and paid regularly, which put them generations ahead of the feudal levies of European kingdoms. Ottoman artillery was formidable. Ottoman siege engineering was arguably the best of the age. And Ottoman logistics, the ability to feed, supply, and move 100,000 men across hundreds of kilometers, was a miracle of administrative organization. Belgrade fell on August 29, 1521. Suleiman was 26 years old. The Ottoman frontier now touched the border of Hungary directly. But even before the dust of Belgrade had settled, Suleiman turned his eyes to the sea. Chapter 4, The Crusader Island Falls. For over 2 centuries, the Knights of St. John had held the island of Rhodes, a rocky fortress in the Aegean, positioned directly across the Ottoman sea lanes between Istanbul and Egypt. The Knights were the last organized remnant of the Crusader military orders, a multinational Catholic military brotherhood who had transformed their island into one of the most formidable fortresses in the Mediterranean world. They were also, from an Ottoman strategic perspective, an intolerable splinter in the empire's side. They raided Ottoman merchant shipping. They sheltered Ottoman enemies. They threatened the sea route to Egypt and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Mehmed the Conqueror had tried to take Rhodes in 1480 and failed, another wound in Ottoman memory. In the summer of 1522, Suleiman arrived before Rhodes with a fleet of 400 vessels and an army of perhaps 100,000 men. The siege lasted 5 months. The knights, under Grand Master Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, fought with extraordinary courage. Their walls absorbed an unprecedented bombardment. The Ottomans fired an estimated 3.5 million cannonballs during the siege. Tunneling, counter-tunneling, night assault, artillery barrage, assault after assault, the knights held on through a defense that became legendary across Europe. But they could not hold forever. Outnumbered, undersupplied, and with no relief coming from a Europe too fractured by the Protestant Reformation to organize a crusade, the knights finally negotiated surrender in December 1522. And here Suleiman did something that surprised everyone. He allowed them to leave. The knights were permitted to depart with their arms, their honor, their religious objects, and the civilians who wished to accompany them. No massacre, no enslaving of the population. The terms were generous to the point of being almost incomprehensible to a European military tradition that generally expected captured fortresses to be put to the sword. Grand Master Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, departing with what remained of his brotherhood, reportedly told the assembled knights, "Nothing in the world was ever so well lost as this city." Suleiman, watching them go from the harbor walls, is reported to have said to Ibrahim, "It saddens me to compel this old man to leave his home." Whether the words are exactly true is unknowable. What is not in doubt is that the act itself, the mercy shown to a defeated enemy, traveled across Europe faster than any military dispatch. This was the paradox at the center of how Europe understood Suleiman. The man who was conquering them was also, repeatedly, demonstrating a magnanimity that shamed them. The Knights of St. John retreated first to Sicily, then to Malta, where they would rebuild their fortress and wait for 43 years for the return of the Ottomans. Chapter 5, Mohacs, the destruction of medieval Hungary. In the summer of 1526, Suleiman marched north. His objective was Hungary, the last major Christian kingdom standing between the Ottoman frontier and the heart of Europe. Hungary in 1526 was a kingdom under severe pressure, internally divided between pro-Habsburg and pro-Ottoman factions, financially exhausted and ruled by the young and inexperienced King Louis II, who had ascended the throne as a 10-year-old child and had never commanded an army. The Ottoman advance was methodical and irresistible. Fortress after fortress fell or surrendered as the army crossed the Drava River and entered Hungarian territory. The Hungarian nobility, perpetually quarreling over taxes and privilege, mobilized too slowly and too reluctantly. On August 29, 1526, exactly 5 years to the day after the fall of Belgrade, the two armies met on the flat plain of Mohacs near the Danube in southern Hungary. The Hungarian army numbered perhaps 25 to 30,000. The Ottoman force was perhaps 100,000, with perhaps 300 cannon arranged in a massive arc across the plain. The battle lasted 2 hours. The Hungarian heavy cavalry, magnificent in their armor, brave beyond question, charged the Ottoman line. They broke the Janissary infantry in places. They fought their way toward the Ottoman center. And then the Ottoman cannon, fired in disciplined volleys from behind a defensive line of wagons and chains, tore through them. King Louis II of Hungary fled the field and drowned in a swamp crossing the Schelle stream in his heavy armor. He was 20 years old. The Hungarian nobility died on the field, 2 archbishops, 5 bishops, many of the greatest lords of the kingdom, perhaps 16,000 men in a matter of hours. Suleiman recorded the battle in his personal diary, the Suleiman name, with a directness that is startling in its brevity. He noted the number of enemy dead. He recorded the condition of the terrain. He noted the weather. What the diary does not record, what no official document recorded, was what Suleiman ordered after the battle. Mohacs was a complete victory, but the aftermath was complicated. In the days following the battle, thousands of prisoners, Many of them common soldiers and peasants were executed. The great city of Buda, the Hungarian capital, was occupied but not formally annexed. Suleiman garrisoned it briefly and then withdrew, installing a client ruler rather than incorporating Hungary directly into the empire. This decision would haunt the Ottoman-Habsburg relationship for the next century and a half. Hungary became a contested borderland, a three-way division between the Ottomans, the Habsburgs, and a nominally independent Transylvania that was in practice an Ottoman client state. Medieval Hungary effectively ended at Mohacs. It never recovered as an independent kingdom. Chapter 6, The Road to Vienna. After Mohacs, the logic of Ottoman expansion pointed northwest toward the greatest prize of all, Vienna. Vienna was the capital of the Habsburg dynasty, the seat of Charles V's brother, Ferdinand of Habsburg, who had inherited the Austrian lands and claimed the vacant throne of Hungary after Louis II's death. Taking Vienna would mean breaking the Habsburg power that was the most sustained organized resistance to Ottoman expansion in Europe. It would mean the Danube Corridor, the great river highway of Central Europe, would be entirely in Ottoman hands. In 1529, Suleiman moved on Vienna with the largest army he had yet assembled. The campaign was a logistical nightmare from the beginning. The summer of 1529 was unusually wet. The roads of the Balkans turned to mud, the rivers flooded, and the heavy artillery that had decided Mohacs could not be moved at the speed the campaign required. Suleiman left much of his siege artillery behind, rather than lose the campaigning season waiting for the roads to dry. He arrived before Vienna in late September, dangerously late in the campaigning season for a siege in the northern European climate. The city was defended by perhaps 16,000 troops under the command of Philip, Count Palatine, outnumbered but behind walls that were more modern and better prepared than Mohacs had led anyone to expect. The Ottoman siege lasted 3 weeks. Without the heavy guns, the Ottomans could not effectively breach the walls. Mining operations, tunneling beneath the walls to collapse them with explosives, were detected and countered by the Viennese defenders. Assault after assault was repelled. And then, in mid-October, the weather turned. Snow fell. The Janissaries, who had marched from Istanbul and whose campaign season was already stretched to its breaking point, began to lose effectiveness in conditions they were not equipped for. On October 14, 1529, Suleiman ordered the withdrawal. He burned his camp, he turned east, and he took with him tens of thousands of Austrian prisoners, the scattered populations of a dozen villages, and the psychological weight of being the Ottoman Sultan who had come closest to taking Vienna, and turned back. Vienna became, in European memory, the moment the Ottoman tide broke. In Ottoman memory, it was something more complicated, a campaign incomplete, a city that would need to be tried again. Suleiman would attempt Vienna once more in 1532 and again be turned back by weather and logistics and the extraordinary defensive preparations of Charles V. The city was never taken, but it was never forgotten. Chapter 7. The Lawgiver, Suleiman's greatest achievement. In the West, he is Suleiman the Magnificent. In the Ottoman world, he was always Suleiman Kanuni, Suleiman the Lawgiver. And if you want to understand which name captures the man more accurately, the answer is the Ottoman one. The word kanun comes from the Greek kanun, a rule, a measure, a standard. In the Ottoman context, it referred to the body of secular law that the Sultan issued through imperial decree, law that existed alongside, and in careful calibration with, the Islamic Sharia. The relationship between kanun and Sharia was one of the defining tensions of Ottoman governance, the Sultan's authority to legislate versus the religious scholar's authority to interpret divine law. Suleiman resolved this tension not by subordinating one to the other, but by systematizing both with unprecedented thoroughness. Over the course of his reign, he oversaw the compilation and codification of Ottoman law on a scale that had never been attempted before. Criminal law, land tenure, taxation, the rights of subjects, the obligations of officials, the regulation of commerce, the treatment of non-Muslim communities under the dhimmi system. All of it was gathered, reviewed, rewritten where necessary, and organized into a coherent legal framework that would govern the empire for generations. This was not merely bureaucratic housekeeping. It was a philosophical statement about what the Ottoman Empire was and what it aspired to be. Suleiman's legal reforms treated the subjects of the empire, Muslim and non-Muslim, Turkish and Arab and Greek and Armenian and Jewish, as people with rights that the state was obligated to protect. The Ottoman millet system, which allowed non-Muslim communities to govern their own internal affairs under their own religious law, was formalized and extended during his reign. The Qanun applied to the Sultan's own officials as rigorously as to his subjects. Corruption was punished. Extortion was punishable by death. The rights of peasants to their land were clarified and protected against the encroachments of feudal landholders. Suleiman himself was deeply involved in this work. It was not delegated to bureaucrats. He read legal opinions. He corresponded with jurists. He appointed the great Sheikhul Islam Abu Suud Effendi to reconcile Qanun with Sharia in a series of legal opinions that became foundational texts of Ottoman jurisprudence. This was the work of a man who understood that conquest builds an empire and law sustains it. Suleiman had been conquering since the first year of his reign. Now, in the middle decades of his sultanate, he was building something that could survive him. The empire he governed at its peak stretched from the borders of Morocco in the west to the Persian Gulf in the east, from the plains of Hungary and the Crimea in the north to the coasts of Yemen and Somalia in the south. Governing this was not a matter of military force alone. It required trust, the trust of subjects who believed that the law would treat them fairly, regardless of their religion or their language or their origin. Suleiman's legal legacy is the most durable thing he built. The Kanuni Osmani, the Ottoman legal code associated with his reign, continued to shape Ottoman governance until the 19th century, and its echoes can be traced in the legal traditions of every country that was once part of the empire. Chapter 8. The Builder, Sinan, and the Suleymaniye Mosque. In 1538, Suleiman gave his chief architect Mimar Sinan the commission that would define both their careers. Build me a mosque worthy of this empire. Sinan was already in his 50s, old by the standards of the age, but in his prime as an architect. He had come, like Ibrahim, through the Devshirme system, taken as a young Christian boy from Anatolia, or perhaps from the Cappadocian region of central Turkey, educated in the palace school, trained initially as a military engineer. He had served on Suleiman's campaigns. He had built bridges, fortifications, supply depots, and water systems in the field. And then, in 1538, he was appointed chief imperial architect. The Ottoman equivalent of Michelangelo crossed with a military engineer and was given the greatest architectural patronage on earth. He proceeded to build more structures than Michelangelo would have imagined possible. By the end of his career, he had designed or supervised nearly 500 buildings across the empire. Mosques, mausoleums, palaces, schools, hospitals, bridges, aqueducts, caravanserai, khans, baths, and fortifications. His output was extraordinary, not just in volume, but in quality, each building a careful solution to problems of structure, light, space, and meaning. But the Suleymaniye Mosque was his masterpiece of the Middle Period, and it remains one of the greatest buildings in human history. Construction began in 1550 and was completed in 1558. The site chosen was a hilltop in Istanbul, looking down over the Golden Horn, visible from the Bosphorus, visible from the Asian shore, visible from almost anywhere in the city. Suleiman wanted it to announce the empire from every direction. Sinan made it announce the empire for 5 centuries. The dome of the Suleymaniye is 53 meters high and 27 meters in diameter, not as large as Hagia Sophia's dome, which Sinan was in explicit conversation with and competition against. But where Hagia Sophia achieves its effect through sheer scale and the accumulated power of centuries of sanctity, the Suleymaniye achieves it through perfect proportion. The dome sits on 4 enormous piers, flanked by 2 semi-domes that continue the curve, creating a spatial flow that feels organic rather than imposed. The interior wall space, freed from the structural burden that the piers carry, is filled with Iznik tiles and high clerestory windows that flood the space with Mediterranean light. Sinan reportedly said late in his life that the Suleymaniye was the work of his apprenticeship, that his true masterpiece came later in the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne. Historians have debated this with enormous energy for 5 centuries and have not resolved it to anyone's satisfaction. Both buildings are extraordinary. The debate itself is a measure of how high the standard was. The Suleymaniye complex was not just a mosque. Like all Ottoman imperial mosque complexes, Kulliye, it was a city within a city. A hospital, a medical school, 4 Quran schools, a soup kitchen feeding hundreds of people daily, a caravanserai for travelers, a public bath, the tombs of Suleiman and Hurrem themselves. It was welfare infrastructure and religious architecture and political statement all at once. When it was completed in 1558, Suleiman attended the opening ceremony and, according to contemporary accounts, personally swept the threshold of the mosque before entering, in an act of deliberate humility. The Sultan who had conquered Belgrade, Rhodes, and Hungary, who had faced Charles V and the Shah of Persia, who had sat on the throne of the Ottoman Empire for nearly 40 years, swept a doorstep. It is one of the most revealing moments in his recorded life. Chapter 9, The Court of Shadows, Hurrem, Ibrahim, and Mustafa. Behind the campaigns and the legal codes and the great mosque, the Ottoman court was a place of extraordinary human complexity, and in the middle decades of Suleiman's reign, 3 relationships defined that complexity and eventually destroyed the most beloved figures in his life. Hurrem Sultan entered the imperial harem at some point in the early 1520s. Her origins are not certain. She was almost certainly Eastern European, probably from the Ruthenian regions of what is today Western Ukraine, captured or purchased in the slave markets that fed the imperial household. In the harem, she was given the name Hurrem, the cheerful one. European sources, usually hostile, called her Roxolana, the Russian. What happened next is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of any royal court. Hurrem became Suleiman's favorite consort. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that the relationship deepened over years into something that Ottoman tradition had no framework for, and that defied every expectation of what a sultan's relationship with a harem woman could be. Suleiman gave her a suite of rooms connected directly to his own apartments, breaking the physical separation between the imperial household and the women's quarters that was a fundamental of Ottoman court architecture. He freed her from slave status. He gave her legal personhood. And in approximately 1534, the exact date is debated by historians, he married her. This was an act without precedent in Ottoman history. The Valid Sultan tradition, the power wielded by a sultan's mother, was established and accepted. But sultans did not marry their concubines. They took concubines, had children by them, and maintained the separation of the harem from the formal political sphere precisely because a married consort with legal rights was a political actor. A concubine was not. Hurrem became a political actor. She corresponded directly with foreign rulers, with the King of Poland, with the Safavid court. Her letters survive. They are intelligent, informed, and clearly the work of a woman who understood exactly what she was doing. She commissioned her own architectural projects, the Haseki Sultan complex in Istanbul, a mosque complex that bore her own name, the first time in Ottoman history that an imperial mosque complex had been commissioned by anyone other than the Sultan himself. And she was the center of the storm that would eventually claim 2 of the most important men in Suleiman's life. Ibrahim Pasha had risen from the page. Suleiman befriended in Manisa to the position of Grand Vizier, the most powerful non-royal position in the empire, the man who was effectively the Sultan's executive. Suleiman trusted him completely, elevated him to extraordinary heights, and gave him powers that no previous Grand Vizier had held. Ibrahim commanded armies. He conducted independent diplomacy. He collected extraordinary wealth. He accumulated a prestige that began, in the eyes of the court, to rival the Sultan's own. The relationship between Ibrahim and Hurrem was complex and contested. Historians dispute whether it was simple rivalry or something more nuanced. What is not disputed is that it ended in 1536, when Suleiman, on a single night in March, ordered Ibrahim strangled in the palace. The execution order was Suleiman's own. The grounds were never formally stated. Hints of treason, of financial corruption, of overreach. The intimacy of the act, carried out in the palace where Ibrahim had lived as the Sultan's closest companion, made it devastating in its personal dimension. Suleiman never spoke publicly about Ibrahim's death. He continued to govern. He composed poetry. The court moved on, but something in him changed after 1536, in the way that the death of a person you have loved and then destroyed changes you at a level too deep for outward expression. The The second catastrophe came 17 years later. Shehzade Mustafa was Suleiman's eldest son by his first consort, Mahidevran Sultan, a woman of fierce pride who had been effectively displaced by Hurrem. Mustafa had grown up in the provincial courts, governing sanjaks as all princes did, and had developed into a man of extraordinary quality, physically imposing, militarily capable, genuinely popular with the Janissaries and the common people in a way that made him his father's obvious and beloved heir. He was too popular. In the brutal calculus of dynastic succession, an enormously popular heir is a threat to a reigning sultan, because men rally to the popular prince before the old sultan is dead, which means the old sultan's authority erodes while he is still alive. This was not just Hurrem's fear. It was the fear of any Ottoman ruler who had watched the history of his dynasty, which was littered with the bones of princes who had moved too early or who had simply attracted too much attention. In 1553, during a military campaign in Anatolia, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his tent. Mustafa came. He may have suspected something. He was warned by multiple people. He came anyway, either because he trusted his father's word or because he knew that flight would be read as guilt and would seal the fate he was trying to avoid. He was strangled inside the tent. He was 38 years old. The Janissaries' reaction was beyond grief. It was a kind of collective moral rupture. Mustafa had been their prince, their hero, the man they expected to lead them after Suleiman was gone. His death produced open mourning in the camps, the kind of uncontrolled public grief that was a political danger signal in any military hierarchy. The reaction was so extreme that Suleiman was forced to acknowledge it. He had an elegy composed and distributed to try to contain the mourning within acceptable channels. It did not fully work. The shadow of Mustafa's death hung over the final 13 years of Suleiman's reign. The man who had ordered it seemed to age after 1553 at an accelerated pace, as though the decision had taken something from him that campaigns and governance and poetry could not replace. Hurrem Sultan died in 1558, before Suleiman, before seeing the completion of the Suleymaniye mosque that bore both their tombs. She died having achieved things that no woman in Ottoman history had achieved before her. She died with the title of Haseki, the Sultan's favorite, and with a legal standing and public presence that had no precedent and would have no real successor for generations. Suleiman buried her in the turba adjacent to the Suleymaniye, and is recorded to have grieved for her openly, another break with Ottoman convention in which the death of a woman of the harem was not publicly marked. He was 64 years old. He had 8 more years to live. He would spend them governing, campaigning, and composing the poetry he signed with the name Muhibi, the affectionate one. Chapter 10, the Mediterranean, Barbarossa, and the sea. While the land campaigns defined Suleiman's empire in Europe, it was the sea that defined his empire in the Mediterranean, and the sea belonged, for a generation, to one man. Hayreddin Barbarossa was not, by origin, an Ottoman. He and his brother Oruç had been born on the island of Lesbos to a Turkish father and a Greek mother, and had spent their early careers as independent corsairs in the western Mediterranean, raiding Christian shipping and establishing themselves as masters of North African waters. When Oruç was killed fighting the Spanish in 1518, Hayreddin offered the city of Algiers, which the brothers had controlled, to the Ottoman Empire in exchange for recognition and support. Suleiman, recognizing the value of what he was being offered, accepted. Barbarossa was granted the title of Beyler Bey of Algiers, effectively the Ottoman governor of North Africa, and was given Ottoman ships, Ottoman troops, and Ottoman backing. The transformation of the western Mediterranean that followed was one of the most dramatic strategic developments of the 16th century. Barbarossa spent the next 2 decades systematically extending Ottoman naval power across the Mediterranean, raiding the coasts of Spain and Italy, capturing Tunis, defeating Habsburg naval forces, and making the inland sea, in practical terms, an Ottoman lake. In 1533, Suleiman summoned Barbarossa to Istanbul and appointed him Kapudana Derya, Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet. The appointment transformed Ottoman naval strategy from opportunistic raiding into systematic power projection. Barbarossa built, or supervised the building, of a new generation of Ottoman war galleys, and combined this with a tactical and strategic vision that was genuinely extraordinary. He understood the Mediterranean not as a series of separate seas, but as a unified theater of operations, and he managed it accordingly. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Preveza in 1538. A massive Allied fleet, assembled by Pope Paul III and incorporating the naval forces of Venice, the Papacy, Spain, and the Knights of St. John, sailed to challenge Ottoman dominance of the Ionian Sea. On paper, the Allied fleet was formidable. The Genoese admiral Andrea Doria, one of the most experienced naval commanders in Europe, led the Christian force. Barbarossa met them with roughly 120 galleys and the kind of aggressive tactical vision that Doria, commanding a coalition with differing political interests, could not match. The battle was an Ottoman victory of the first order. The Allied fleet was scattered, with significant losses and without having landed a decisive blow. After Preveza, Ottoman naval dominance of the eastern and central Mediterranean was essentially uncontested for a generation. The only significant reverse came at Malta in 1565, 1 year before Suleiman's death, when the Knights of St. John, in their rebuilt island fortress, withstood an Ottoman siege of extraordinary violence. The Great Siege of Malta lasted 4 months, cost the Ottomans perhaps 30,000 men, and ended with an Ottoman withdrawal that Europe celebrated with the bells of every church from London to Lisbon. Suleiman had planned to return to Malta personally. He never did. Chapter 11, The Last Campaign. In 1566, Suleiman was 71 years old. He was suffering from gout, a disease that had progressively worsened over years, limiting his mobility and causing him chronic pain. He was carried in a litter for much of his travel now, hidden behind curtains, because the sight of the Sultan being carried rather than riding was a political vulnerability the empire could not afford. The strategic situation in Hungary had been deteriorating. The ceasefire with the Habsburgs was under constant pressure. Local commanders on both sides were raiding and counter-raiding. The new Habsburg Emperor, Maximilian II, was preparing for a major military effort to recover the Hungarian territories. Suleiman decided to campaign himself. This decision was not irrational, though it might seem so, given his age and health. The symbolic value of the Sultan personally leading the army was immense. The Janissaries fought differently when the Sultan's standard was visible. And after the disaster of Malta and years of inconclusive border warfare, the Ottoman military establishment needed the psychological weight of the Sultan's personal presence. He departed Istanbul in May 1566. He was carried for most of the journey. The army moved at the pace he could sustain. The objective was the fortress of Szigetvar, a strong Hungarian fortress held by the Croatian band Miklos Zrinyi, with a garrison of around 2,000 men. Strategically, it was not the most important target in the theater, but it sat on the road to Vienna, and taking it would demonstrate that the Ottoman military machine still functioned, that the Sultan's arm still reached. The siege began in August 1566. Zrinyi's garrison defended with extraordinary determination, a defense that would become one of the great stories of Croatian and Hungarian history. The Ottomans slowly reduced the outer works, flooded the defenders, burned portions of the fortress. And then on September 6, 1566, in the early hours of the morning, inside his campaign tent at the Ottoman headquarters, Suleiman I died. The cause was almost certainly multiple organ failure. His gout had been accompanied by other symptoms consistent with kidney disease. He had been gravely ill for some time. His camp physicians had known. His Grand Vizier, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, had known. No one told the army. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha made one of the most extraordinary administrative decisions in Ottoman history. He concealed the Sultan's death. He continued to issue orders in the Sultan's name. He had the Sultan's body embalmed by camp physicians. He sent a fast rider to Istanbul to summon Suleiman's son and successor, Selim II, and he maintained the fiction that the Sultan was alive, gravely ill, but alive and directing the campaign, for a total of 48 days. During those 48 days, the siege of Szigetvar was completed. Zrinyi, understanding that no relief was coming, led his surviving garrison in a final charge against the Ottoman lines. He died fighting. The fortress fell. The campaign, in military terms, was a success. And then Selim II arrived, and the news could be made official. Suleiman's body was transported to Istanbul in a procession that took weeks. He was buried in the turba he had prepared for himself, adjacent to the Suleymaniye Mosque, next to Hurrem. The campaign tent he died in, and the embalmed heart and internal organs removed during the embalming process, were buried at Szigetvar, a sacred site that exists to this day in what is now southern Hungary. Suleiman I had reigned for 46 years. He had added to the Ottoman Empire more territory than any sultan before or after him. He had reformed its law, rebuilt its capital, dominated its seas, and outlasted every rival who had opposed him. He died at the age of approximately 71 or 72, on campaign, in a tent, with his army around him. It was the death he would have chosen. Chapter 12. The Secret in the Tent. The 48 days of concealment that followed Suleiman's death are one of the most operationally remarkable episodes in the history of any empire. Consider what Sokolu Mehmed Pasha was managing, an army of tens of thousands of men, including the Janissaries, a force that had deposed sultans before, and would again, could not be allowed to learn that their sultan was dead before the succession was secured. The distance between the Szigetvar camp and Istanbul was roughly 1,000 kilometers. A fast rider could cover it in a few days, but Selim II, the designated successor, was in Kütahya in western Anatolia. The round trip, the message going and Selim coming, required time. During those 48 days, orders continued to be issued in Suleiman's name. The siege was concluded in his name. The fortress of Szigetvar fell in his name. Dispatches were sent to Istanbul and to provincial governors in his name. The imperial seal was applied to documents by his Grand Vizier. The body, meanwhile, was preserved in the summer heat by the camp physicians, a process that required considerable skill and considerable discretion, since even the smell of embalming could betray what was being done in the Sultan's tent. When Selim II finally arrived at the camp, and the concealment could end, the reaction of the Janissaries was one of the documented moments of collective grief in Ottoman history. The cry that went up from the army when the death was announced could be heard, according to accounts, from a considerable distance. The Ottoman state, however, absorbed the transition with the efficiency that Sokolu Mehmed Pasha had engineered. There was no coup, no succession crisis, no civil war between claimants. The empire continued. Chapter 13. The Legacy of the Magnificent. Suleiman the Magnificent died in 1566. The empire he built outlasted him by 3.5 centuries, surviving until 1922. The legal code he established remained foundational Ottoman law for over 250 years. The mosque Sinan built for him still stands on its Istanbul hilltop, visited by millions of people each year, its 4 pencil minarets and cascading domes as recognizable as any building on earth. His reputation in the West was paradoxical from the beginning. He was feared as the instrument of conquest, the destroyer of medieval Hungary, the man who had stood before the gates of Vienna. And simultaneously he was admired, reluctantly but genuinely, as a ruler of a sophistication, a justice, and a cultural achievement that Europe's fractured kingdoms found difficult to match and impossible to ignore. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman corresponded in some senses with the Renaissance in Europe. While Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel, and Leonardo was studying anatomy, and Copernicus was reordering the solar system, Sinan was building the Suleymaniye. Ottoman scholars were producing works of mathematics and cartography and astronomy. Piri Reis was drawing his extraordinary map of the Atlantic. Leke and Hurrem Sultan was conducting diplomatic correspondence in 3 languages. It was not a world apart from Renaissance Europe. It was in many respects its equal, and by some measures its superior. The personal story of Suleiman resists easy summary. He was a conqueror who showed mercy, a lawgiver who ordered the execution of his best friend and his most beloved son, a man who wrote private poetry to his wife under a pseudonym that translated to the affectionate one, and who publicly swept the threshold of the mosque he had built in an act of deliberate humility, a ruler of absolute power who understood, better than most absolute rulers have, that power alone does not sustain an empire. In 1819, the English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote his great poem Ozymandias, not about Suleiman, but about the hubris of power and the indifference of time to human achievement. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. The stone face shattered in the desert, the colossal wreck. The Suleymaniye Mosque is not a colossal wreck. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is a functioning place of worship visited by millions. The call to prayer rises from its minarets 5 times a day, as it has since 1558. Some things outlast the desert. Some works, built with sufficient skill and sufficient vision and sufficient understanding of what human beings need from the buildings they inhabit, outlast the empires that commissioned them, the men that designed them, the centuries that erode everything else. Suleiman ibn Selim, Kanuni, the lawgiver, the magnificent, the shadow of God on earth. He was born in a provincial Ottoman city in 1494. He governed half the known world. He reformed its laws, built its greatest monuments, dominated its seas, faced down its most powerful rulers, and outlived most of the people he loved. He died in a tent in Hungary, in the dark before dawn, with his army around him and his empire intact. He was, by any measure that history applies to such men, magnificent. 5 centuries have passed. Istanbul is still there, where Mehmed the Conqueror placed it, at the junction of Europe and Asia, astride the narrow strait between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The Suleymaniye Mosque is still there, on its hilltop above the Golden Horn, its dome visible from the water as Suleiman intended it to be visible. Inside, in the filtered light falling through high clerestory windows onto walls of Iznik tile, the geometry Mimar Sinan worked out on parchment and then built in stone and lead and marble still holds. The proportions he calculated, the ratios of dome to half-dome, of height to width, of light to shadow, still function as he intended them to function, to make the human being entering the space feel, simultaneously, very small and very much at home in the universe. In the adjacent Turbe, Suleiman and Hurrem lie in the tombs that bear their names. At Sigitvar, in what is now southern Hungary, there is a memorial where the Ottoman camp once stood, and where the embalmed heart of the Sultan was left behind when his body traveled back to Istanbul. The site was lost for centuries, excavated and identified only in the 21st century. The discovery made headlines across Turkey and Hungary alike. The reed pen he wrote his poetry with, the Kanun scrolls that governed an empire, the dome that rises above a city he made magnificent, the heart buried in the Hungarian earth, far from home. These are what remain. And the first call to prayer of the day, rising from the Suleymaniye's minarets over the Bosphorus, before the light comes, before the city wakes, that too remains. Some things outlast everything,